My name is Bradley Steyn. I was born in Pretoria, South Africa. Growing up, I witnessed firsthand the brutality of hate and apartheid. And as a teenager in 1988, I survived a massacre that would change the course of my life forever. And that's why I decided to take a stand and join the intelligence unit of Nelson Mandela's spy network. In the course of our dedicated efforts during that time, we successfully unearthed a sinister plot to assassinate Nelson Mandela at his 1994 inauguration. This was a pivotal moment in South African history. Would we go into civil war? Would there be peace? But it also marked a significant stride towards advancing human rights for all us South Africans. Little did I know, a hit was placed on us, and I just managed to escape South Africa and find refuge abroad. I used my experiences and my expertise and teamed up with leading security professionals, where I was fortunate enough to work with some of the most fascinating people in the world. Now I'm back in South Africa, ready to take on the rising tide of crime, murder, and corruption that has tainted South Africa's journey towards liberation and our democracy. Join me, Bradley Steyn, your co-host, along with journalist and author Janet Smith, and our special lineup of guests as we go undercover. In this series, we will be declassifying our past, while we bring you the untold stories of our silent warriors, activists, and patriots. We'll also get a different perspective from our youth, where our democracy is today, 30 years later. Through these conversations, together we could shape the future we aspire to.
Baron Stradum's racist massacre on a public square in Pretoria was one of the defining events of the last years of apartheid. It was November 1988. Global condemnation and international boycotts were finally grinding the world's supremacist outpost to a halt. But even as expectations grew that there could be a peaceful transition to democracy, some, like Stradum, believed whites were being betrayed. The former policeman and army conscript set out to make his statement in the most horrifying way possible. In total, 8 black people were the victims of his rage. The blood that covered the piazza outside the State Theatre also came to mark the boundary between freedom and a form of captivity for Bradley Steyn, who was a teenager when he walked into the mass shooting. Bradley's life was spared by the killer because he was white. Yet that bloodied boundary was so destructive to his mental health that Bradley eventually put down those experiences and the astonishing true-life events which followed into a non-fiction thriller, Undercover with Mandela's Spies. This podcast takes you on a journey with Bradley and a number of extraordinary guests to examine the toll South Africa's battlefields has taken on our minds and how we can continue to work on our shared recovery. I am Janet Smith, and in this episode, we welcome American philanthropist Linda Biehl to a conversation about what it means to forgive and what the understanding is today of that journey. Please join us for How to Forgive, which is created in honor of Stradum's 8th victim, 52-year-old Sattar Abdul Karim. Sattar was shot in the hip and in the jaw area in the same record shop as Stradum's previous victim, Msongela Johannes Nisi. He was trying to assist Johannes, who was dying. Thank you for joining us. I'll hand over to Bradley now to welcome Linda.
Linda, thank you so very much for being here. And I know this is a very important time of the year for you, being on the 29th anniversary of Amy's murder. Linda, could you please just paint a picture of who Amy was and her background and how she ended up coming to South Africa to want to fight for equality and help organize and educate people on voting?
Well, I have 4 children, and Amy was the second. She was always sort of that overachiever when she was little. As her sister learned to walk, she learned to walk. She was always pushing herself from the very first months of her life. So as she grew up, some of it went into sports and championship diving and swimming, and some of it went into music, playing the flute, and some of it went. But as she became more and more educated, and along with her older sister in high school, there was a lot happening in South Africa. And they started reading about Nelson Mandela and what was going on. And their favorite song was by the Specials, Free Nelson Mandela. I won't sing it for you, I'm terrible. But it became something, I think, to a lot of American students around the country and others who started to demonstrate for lifting of sanctions for South Africa, because they were getting so much money from their gold and diamonds, and it was going into universities like Harvard and Stanford. So a lot of the students started to hold various types of protest, I guess. So when Amy started at Stanford University, she began to participate in some anti-apartheid activities, and she decided to major in international relations with an emphasis on sub-Saharan Africa. And then Namibia became her area of expertise, and she went to Namibia upon graduation and worked, actually was on her honors thesis. She interviewed government people like George Shultz and Chester Crocker's negotiation of the Namibia. She was a student, definitely. Yeah. But when she went to Namibia that summer of graduation, she came back to America filled with young idealism and whatnot. And she moved from California to Washington, D.C., where she struggled to find a job, like many young women. And she became an intern at, I think it was Bart Gordon's congressman. She did all kinds of stuff like that. And then she interviewed at Brookings and a few others. And then she interviewed at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Washington, NDI as it's known. And NDI was worked around the world and helping emerging democracies, how to craft democracies, how to do that kind of work. And she was really, really, really excited to get this job. So it started taking her to Africa, a number of countries, mostly Namibia, where she worked with Sam Njomo and their parliament, Mose Tichinjero, all these people. It's like she talked about these people. I said, who are these people? I'm a mom of 3 kids still in California or in college and whatnot. And my son was only, 16 when Amy died. So it's like still very much a mom and busy with sort of normal things.
Yeah.
So she, while she was in Namibia and a lot of her work at NDI there, she met a lot of South Africans who came to, NDI was not working in South Africa at the time. And so they started meeting her. And kind of this thing developed where they said, Amy, when are you coming to South Africa? When are you coming to South Africa? So when her, she kind of looked around, and when she was looking, she applied for a Fulbright grant, allowing her to come to South Africa for 10 months. And it was a grant to, she had been working in voter education with NDI, but the grant was actually to study women's role in the transformation. And she decided to sort of base her work out of the University of the Western Cape, which, as you know, is not the white institution like UCT. And she ended up meeting and working with people like Dullah Omar, Minister of Justice. Albie Sachs his office was down. Rhoda Kadali, Bridget Mbandla, and Dullah was the head of the Law Institute, whatever they called it now. So basically, she was right in it. And so she was a thorough researcher. So it got to the point where she would go around interviewing people, and many of them told me that she would sit quietly in the back and really listen to them. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She had a clunky early computer 30 years ago, And then at the end she would say, by the way, these are my notes if you would like them. So she didn't push it as this scholar, as this person. She emerged with the people, and I think was accepted as not just an outsider. She learned Xhosa. She took jazz art. She really became a part of, I think, the Cape Town club scene.
Yeah.
She danced, and she lived with I have a hard time with using this word, but with a colored woman in a little flat in Mowbray. And then they traveled to UWC together and whatnot. So she loved it, and she was happy. And we called every Sunday. It was before all the new stuff, the phones. So it was old-fashioned communication. But we kept in touch with her. And while she was here, she worked a lot on the new Constitution, and particularly women's and children's rights. And several people, including Rhoda Kodali, who was he said, Amy was our source. I mean, she really was a part of this. And when her time was coming due at the University of the Western Cape, she wrote her thesis and was going to present it. One thing I've learned is transportation in and out of the townships is very difficult. So she had bought an old car that could get them to and from. And several of her friends who were, black students at UWC needed a ride home on this August night. And it was cold, and their ride had left them. And they said, Amy, can you give us a ride into Guguletu, and we'll get the taxis back to her home. And it happened to be just 2 days before she was due to come home and start a PhD program at Rutgers University in South African research and stuff. So in the meantime, there was a lot of young people who were not happy with Mandela, not happy with the ANC and their negotiations that were taking place for planning for the free elections. So one of the organizations, the Pan-African Congress, the PAC, had a youth presence, and they were feeling that the ANC was a sellout. They wanted the land back. That was their main goal. They wanted the land back. And there were leaders here in Cape Town, including a woman who was the former mayor and is well known. She ran for president, and she was a leader that day at a rally. And I think it was in Langa. I'm not quite sure, but it was inciting. As politicians, they were inciting teenagers who were members of the youth organizations and who had seen, tremendous violence in their communities, and their parents and grandparents struggling, and children killed, and the police coming. I mean, they did not have normal lives that we would consider normal. So she decided, she brought the students home, and she kind of understood what was going on. And those students coming from the rally, and the slogan of the day was "One settler, one bullet," the settler being the white person. We killed the white person with one bullet. Well, she is driving home, as life has strange collisions and whatnot. She was driving these three people home, and as she was driving on the main road into Guguletu, which is the black township where, she'd probably been in there before, but it was definitely a time that there was heightened activity. And intense, yeah. They were, one of the things is make the townships ungovernable. Yeah. So they were throwing rocks at like a bread truck that would come in, and they let one come in and sell, but then they'd throw rocks. Well, as it happened, she was pulling up, and I think it was behind a Coca-Cola truck or something in front of the gas station on the main entry into Guguletu, and she had to stop. And this group of mostly men, young men in their teens, actually, were coming from this rally, singing freedom songs or whatever. And all of a sudden, they saw this white girl driving this little old Mazda stuck behind a truck. So they picked up rocks and started stoning her car. And Amy was an athlete, and she had done 2 Oceans Marathon. She'd done the the Comrades Marathon here. So her friend said, Amy, run, get up and run. And she was hit by a brick in her head, and she said, I can't, I just can't. And so she got out of the car, and then she was stabbed at night to death in front of the Caltech station in Guguletu. That's sort of what happened at the beginning. And as a family in California, we were notified. I was out back to school shopping with my 16-year-old son because they were getting ready to start school. And I was taking a week off work. We were getting ready for Amy to come home. Her boyfriend, who was in law school, he was a basketball player at Stanford. They knew each other, had told my husband that he was going to ask Amy to marry him when she came home, and then she was going to turn around and go to New Jersey to Rutgers University. Sure. So we were preparing for this, and then the phone rang. My son Zach and I walked in the house. I had my little white Mustang convertible, the first little fun car I ever had after 4 kids. The top was down. It's a beautiful day in Newport Beach, which is not unlike Cape Town, and gorgeous. And we walked in the house. It was such a nice day. We were happy. And the phone was ringing when we got in the house, and I picked it up, and it was my daughter Kim, who was calling from her work in the area, and she said, Mom, are you sitting down? And I okay, what's going on? No one tells when someone says, sit down, are you sitting?
It's bad news.
And then she just said, Amy's dead. It's like, okay. Okay, so what happened? In the meantime, the State Department had been trying to reach us, but they wouldn't leave a message. But my daughter Molly was at that time working in D.C., and they found her. My girls had a little high profile in D.C., knew quite a few of the government people and whatnot. So, so Molly, we got a hold of Molly, and she said the State Department had called her and the whole thing, and then the phone never stopped ringing for weeks, I swear. So we, my son and I, first my son was angry, and I, people think, you weren't angry. I said,
how old was your son?
16.
Oh, wow.
And he was a young guy, same age as the guys that, did the deed. So he did go out and throw a lawn chair and a few things like that, but our phone started ringing like crazy. And he came back and he said, Mom, I'm going to help you. And he was there, So various things. The first phone call I got was, as I was sort of hanging up from one to another, the first media phone call was from a paper in Johannesburg. And I actually got the information more what actually happened from them than I did, anyone else. And then he said, so what do you think? And what was she doing there? And because she had been there when Chris Hani was assassinated, she had gone through much of what was happening with the disenfranchised youth in South Africa. So she had an idea and had already explained the concern about where their energy was going. Youth energy was going into freedom fighting, So basically, I told the reporter, I said, well, this is what Amy told me. It was like, this was coming in one ear and out, like what she said. And then the ambassador called and da-da-da. So we went through all that kind of stuff. And what do you do with your body? President Clinton called. Amy knew Madeline. I mean, we had a lot of government connection, actually, through NDI. And people started coming to our house. South Africans who went to University, Cal Irvine came over. People sat vigil with us. Amy's friends came down from Stanford. I'm not sure I could ever go through any of this again. Satellite trucks were, and if it were social media right now, I'd probably go absolutely freak out. But we had radio, TV. The Today Show wanted to take us across the street where the high school. I mean, it was total media and chaos, and and love, because people we didn't know just, wrote letters. The post office started they brought flowers, and we sat in our living room with people sitting vigil with flowers around us. And it was horrible, but it was also, you couldn't believe the effect it had on not just South Africa, but on people around us. And they were so helpful and loving.
On the world, I think, because, what she was doing was just so important. It's such a critical junction in our political history, right, Janet? Because it during that time, it was, people were really confused. Chris Hani was assassinated a few weeks before. Mandela and, President Mandela managed to calm everybody down.
But he wasn't yet president. It was still...
That's right. That's right.
It was prior to the elections. There was a lot of negotiations going on to set a date. That was so there was a lot of press that came through that this would delay or this would really cause problems, because I think it was Buthelezi and Mandela, they were all trying to sit down and pull this date together. So we were, I think, also a lot of people who didn't want change in South Africa. Also, they did we got quite a bit of hate mail, but we also got mail from people who said, oh, you don't understand what's going on here. You know what I mean? But Amy had prepared us in so many ways. And so we had to make decisions. That's the thing, what happens when something like this happens. You can't just say, okay, what... So my husband had been on a business trip. He came home. My daughter Molly flew home from Washington, D.C. Neighbors behind us opened the fence between our houses so that Molly could come home without the press and myself. So that night, within a few moments of peace and quiet, we sat down. And there's a picture. I see a picture in the paper. Everyone's that we're seeing. We looked like, but we said, what are we going to do? What are we going to do to support Amy's dream of a free South Africa?
So, Linda, in that sense, you were not only confronting on that day the death of your daughter, your second youngest child, and having to suddenly accept that this had happened completely out of the blue. And it wasn't a car accident. It wasn't, an epileptic fit. She had been murdered, and she hadn't been murdered by somebody on the streets of the United States. She had been murdered in a context that you were not yet completely familiar with. Perhaps you hadn't even been to South Africa yet. No. And so I want to know, did you also, on that day, as a family, have to decide on a response which would have been appropriate to Amy? Were you under that level of pressure, not only to express your grief, but to make a statement that would have been in keeping?
Yes, you have it. And that's exactly right. A lot of people, I don't think, realize we were under pressure. And it was Amy's pressure in many ways. But because she had been very open with her love, and she had been in Africa and whatnot, so we had a sense of it. We had not yet been there. She said, when are you coming over? I mean, we certainly were planning to come over, but she was coming home to start her little next phase. And so I think that was the most important thing, is that to Amy, it would be that we support a process that would continue their road to freedom. As Nelson Mandela's long walk to freedom. Yes. It's a long walk. So we certainly didn't want her death to be a detriment to that end. And so it was hard because there were many people who didn't understand anything about South Africa. Then there were others. Also, I think a lot of the media, and you may have run into this in your life, but they want you to be angry. They push at you to be angry. Well, aren't you angry? Aren't you this? Aren't you that? And it's like, no, it's a horrible void and sadness. But because of Amy's preparation and how we loved her, we had to show that. And so everything we did was really in respect to her and her belief in this country.
Linda,
it's inspiring.
It is inspiring, and I guess it struck us that this is the 29th anniversary of Amy's murder because you are here, and it seems like a suddenly difficult question to ask you, but to maintain nearly 30 years of working on behalf of Amy, or on behalf of Amy's spirit, or carrying Amy's spirit forth, that is a very long time, Linda. And I think there is incalculable admiration for you doing that work, and for not veering away from it, and for not at some point, perhaps after 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, just stopping.
Well, we arrived in South Africa about 6 weeks after Amy's death because the University of the Western Cape, the ANC, and the city invited us to come as a family. They wanted us to see Cape Town and South Africa. I think part of it is they wanted to see that we weren't angry because there was concern that it might disrupt travel. And that people were really concerned that because her death was international news. Yeah. And so by bringing us here, Mayor Keegan met us on a rainy night at the airport. It was all filmed because we were doing a documentary called Inside the Struggle, the Amy Biehl story, which actually was a real difficult. Everyone called and wanted to do these stories. And it's like, my husband had to continue with business in a little bit, but I'm on the phone all today, these news programs, it's like, okay. So as we thought about it, we were told by one producer who called and said, look, we want to do an hour-long documentary following you guys to South Africa. And it's like, I didn't think we wanted to do it. But then we said, okay, we will do it if you tell South African story. If you tell a story comparable, like someone who in South Africa, and there was a case they found of a woman whose husband was killed because their white dog made it, and it happened, I don't know, in Joburg or someplace, but they said they would, and they were good researchers. so they came to our house. Several others came. The memorial service we had for her in Newport Beach, California, was on CNN. So it was like you couldn't really hide from it. But we decided, okay, we'll go. So they did a memorial service at Stanford. We stopped there. We went to New York. We came to South Africa. We landed at Joburg. Of course, we had to meet the ambassadors and the whole thing. And we got a tour of a lifetime. Although they put us up at the Cape Sun. Next morning, we were out there. They were showing us schools, the townships, the way people lived. The kids would come and sing. The principals would come out, and it was like, oh my gosh, they're celebrating Amy, And then the question going into little projects. Oh, and when are you coming to help? By the way, it's like, wow. What? Their expectation, as I said, some of the community meetings we went to and whatnot, they would say, we're in this life together forever. And my family is going like, we are?
Yeah.
But, wow. We learned a lot, and we learned a lot of issues that were going on, and people shared stories, and people like, Della Omar and others had events for us. So we were at UWC, and kids were clapping. These students we met Alan Buzek. We had dinner at Della. we were thrown in with both high-end activists who were not yet in power and people from the community. Yes, we met some fairly okay white people, but it wasn't their world. We were a fancy hotel, but that we were taken where I think Cape Point was the most beautiful thing. They did that sort of stuff. But it was eye-opening. It was also challenging, learning to understand, okay, every time the kids are asked to come out and sing to us, they're taken away from school. Is that right? You know, I mean, we had some like, but, you know, if we hadn't done that trip, because a lot of people said, you can't go to South Africa, they're going to kill you. Or, you know what I mean? It's not just black people, you know?
Yeah.
And yet, as you say, and I wonder why this is not highlighted to the extent that it should be. And you're absolutely right. Suddenly, your lives were forever bonded with that place and that moment, and the way that people here treated you as a family at that moment. Had it been a different engagement, had it been a different kind of mood, that too would have gone forward. And it feels to me that that is what then made you say yes when people said, what are you going to do to help? It was their way of bringing you closer, of keeping you as Amy's parents, of holding on to you. And not the easiest moment to decide, you know, well, let's say yes, or let's commit ourselves. But 30 years later, you're still here. You're still bonded
by these communities and by this place and her spirit.
Yeah, and
you know, her spirit is still here. It's in the spirit of people, you know. So what you're doing in continuing her legacy is remarkable. So
we had an encounter yesterday. My friend Joanna, who has been involved with Possible Movie Project and various things. I've known her since 1996, and she's on this trip, and her partner Russ, and we've been friends and part of this South African American world for a long time. We walked into the Cape Sun because we actually had to use the loo, and Woolworths didn't have one. So I said, well, let's go in the Cape Sun. This is where we were brought that first dark, rainy night when we came to South Africa, put up this hotel, and then we went out in the township. So it was like that, you know, balance of a very fancy hotel in Cape Town and then going to the townships the next morning. So we walked in and sat down and had a cup of coffee, and this lovely man came by the table and somehow kind of looked at me, because we had been asked several times already on this trip, oh, are you Amy's mom? That's what happens. And he looked at me, and so it came out that, yes, I was Amy's mom. And he talked about the fact that his neighbor was one of the 4 young men who killed Amy, or was involved in the killing. I don't really like to call them killers. I think there's a different term. But so we talked to him for quite a while, and it was like, it kind of shook me a little bit, because I was thinking about this particular young man went through I think the other thing we have to realize, we did go through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in that process, the Amnesty hearing. And I also saw a bit of that young man at the trial and at the TRC Amnesty hearing, but he was not, his mental evaluation was not great, and this man confirmed that he has a lot of mental difficulties. But it brought back, you know, keeps bringing back something very alive, and it was very alive to him, very much alive. Yeah. So I think we do really have to mention how that whole process worked, although we had a lot of processes that led us to how do we help. And we did a lot of research with mental health people in the country, with politicians, but we had Guguletu had a street committee, and we met with the chairman. We listened for several years, very specifically. Okay, if we do help, and yes, people did send us money. We do have scholarships at universities and different things, but money to run programs in a township, you know, that's like thinking, oh, we have all the answers. But my husband was a business consultant and did a lot of project work, and he said about it in a very business-like way. And I would go out in the townships and listen to people and say, no, that's not going to work. Mm-hmm. But we did it. And as things went on, we were also invited to many activities in Washington, D.C. And I think there was a time and point in time that Peter and I thought, okay, if we're going to do this, we have to do a South African organization, not a U.S. foundation, but we have to work here. We want unemployment, the whole youth thing. What are their needs, how? And of course they were great, but a lot of them were related. So, we looked at it rather holistically. And one of the mental health people we interviewed was Freeman, I think his name or something. He said, well, we know where youth energy was going in the struggle. But now they've had an election. These young people aren't any better off than they were. In fact, they were turning to more street crime, So
and gangs, stuff,
exactly, that kind of violence. In fact, well, anyway, it was a lot of research. I have thousands of papers on our research in our archives, and I could go through, a very list of things. But in May of 1997, Dullah Omar contacted us and said, the Amnesty Committee now is going to hear their application for amnesty. And we knew that they would apply. And the 4 young men that were eventually arrested and in prison, they were convicted at a trial. They went through a trial. And so we were already working over here, but not too officially yet. It was kind of low-keyed. And we said, Dullah said, are you coming? And we said, yeah, we're actually planning to be there in July. And he goes like, okay, we'll have the amnesty hearing in July. And that was an opportunity to actually try and understand how people need legally to, it wasn't about forgiveness, really. It was about listening to the truth of people who had already experienced bad things and what was going on, and the young people, why they did it. And I'm not going to go into all the legalities of the TRC, but we sat there. They were questioned like a trial, the 4 of them, 4 that were convicted. There were a lot of people at that. And a lot of people have come up to me and said, oh, I was there that day, Mrs. Biehl, But we had prepared a statement, and it's I use it a lot because my husband wrote it out, and I have the transcripts. And what we said is, we have been around, we have seen a lot of the issues, we have understood that if they get released from prison, what are they going to do? So we were thinking of how to get jobs and that, to prevent further violence. And so we didn't oppose amnesty. A lot of people said we tried to get them out. No, we said we did not oppose the South African process that might help heal the nation. It wasn't for the Biehls to come and heal this nation. It was for South African.
To go through the process.
Yeah, and it was their decision. A lot of people thought, oh, are you bringing lawyers? I know Mrs. Honey had a lawyer, and I think several other, people, Steve Biko's family had lawyers. We didn't bring lawyers. In fact, the only lawyers we've ever had in this is setting up a foundation. We weren't going to make it into a criminal case. We weren't going to drag all this out.
Or politicize it.
Politicize it, yeah. So we read our statement. We talked to Desmond Tutu before, and he said, well, I said, what should we say? And he said, well, tell them about Amy and who she was. And so I'm the mother. Of course, I'm the mother. I'm the Makulu and the mother and all that. It's like, so I started out by saying, well, Amy loves sports, and Amy this. All of a sudden, 4 guys who were sitting there like this or whatever, they looked at us. And Tutu was right. The minute I talked about her as a person, they looked me in the eye. They looked Peter in the eye. They looked at us as parents. They used to say, we thought you were propaganda. Now, whoever would have thought of that in the United States? I didn't, but in South Africa, that's what they thought. So when they looked at us in the eye, we had as much power, and they took more, I think, power out of their situation to a certain extent. Like, okay, we can talk now, but all their lawyer was reading all their stuff, It's very much like a regular trial. But all of a sudden, it was people to people. Their parents were there. Their parents shook our head.
Humans to humans.
Yeah, their parents didn't want their sons to go to prison. They didn't know what to do with them. We were. And there were people who thought, this is crazy, this is this. But in our heart, and in our minds, and in our sense of the future, even for our benefit, our mental health to go forward in the future, this was good. This was really good. We did not expect it to bring together a personal relationship. It wasn't so much forgiveness. It was forgiveness is for yourself. You free yourself. You are liberated from all the harm it could do. But if you can forgive, and I've learned a lot from Desmond Tutu and Fred Luskin in the States, other forgiveness expert, but truly, I think because of the South African issue and Amy's love, I don't think we harbored bitterness. It was something else. It was
vengeance.
No vengeance.
Yeah.
It was really about being free, loving Amy, and going forward, I think. And we didn't know we would be so involved in South Africa going forward. But I've become a liaison. My husband died 20 years ago.
Yes, so I was going to say to you, then you lost Peter in 2002. And he was your partner in all of this.
From when we were kids. We were longtime partners.
And your most intimate and closest support around Amy as her parents.
Yeah, we did
that
work
was
together.
A huge
it was. But things go on.
Yeah.
You kind of do what you had to do. And at that time, we had already been working with two of the young men who did get Amnesty, and that's another long story. But they were so sad that Peter died, because Peter was teaching them business skills. Peter was teaching them things that their community had not taught them in their lives. You know what I mean? And they were so shocked when he died, and when I came back, it was like they thought I was going to give up.
Right.
And it's like, no, I'll do what I can. It's not going to be perfect. It's not perfect now, but I will do what I can.
Yes.
And they did come to the States with me quite a bit early on and speak. And so forgiveness became the sort of almost a product out of that we had not necessarily thought of in those terms at the time. But that seems to be what people think about the case is really, or the story, I guess.
My writing partner, Mark Fine, in Los Angeles, actually went to one of those talks. And he told me how incredibly moved he was by that. And I'm just so moved by what you do, and I'm just so grateful that we managed to get you in. And what are you doing tomorrow?
Tomorrow is sort of, I think, Amy's day and my day. My friends' days, but nothing big tomorrow. But we see Easy and Tobacco, the two young men, and they have been involved in other events out there, and they came in and sat with us, and they want to be involved, so we're just going to get some flowers. We were at the flower mart looking at flowers, going to go out, lay them at the spot, and a few friends will probably come by, and then we're going to go to a little restaurant in Guguletu and just be a part of the community, I think.
And you've been here on and off over 29 years, so you've seen this country.
Yeah. We've had houses here. We've lived here, back and forth. But to reconcile is an action verb and I do look things sometimes kind of intellectually. It's not all emotional. There's things to talk about that are a little different. But I think it's an action verb. It takes, you can forgive, it takes one person. It takes yourself, really. But to reconcile, it takes whoever you need to reconcile with. Maybe, it wasn't an outcome that was expected of the TRC necessarily, nor was forgiveness. It was a very practical thing.
That's right.
But when you have an opportunity presented to you that you can meet somebody hand in hand, as we shook hands after the hearing with these young men and saw the reality as they got back into their prison truck and saw their people, it's like, yeah. So it's been a year. They get out of prison in July 1998, and they come home. And we said in the news, we missed Amy that day. It was a sad day. We're not hiding that this was not.
Of course.
But what do they do when they get out of prison? They went hiding, or they could have gotten in trouble. There were different things. But it's like, these people had asked us. So they actually came to us, 2 of them. And so we've started a youth group in Guguletu, and we're trying to take kids out of their environment and climb Table Mountain or go to the ocean to see, because the townships are, confining, and they were trying to open things up, and it was their own idea. And they called, and they said, can we come see you at your office, Easy and Tobacco? And it was like, yeah, come. And they came. We thought they were going to ask for money just to start the youth group. They didn't. They were going to name it. It was a Sutu name that meant we are all together. And, in some ways our situation was quite organic. It wasn't so much, okay, you do this. It wasn't not a 10-step thing at all. It was, they were so small, and they were like, trying to figure out what to do to not only improve their lives, but the lives of their people, their neighbors, their friends they grew up with. And they had already done a few things, and it was like, so my husband and I said, so what can we do? And they said, well, could you come out to one of our youth group meetings? And we go out Sunday nights, getting dark in Guguletu, and it's like, listen to their manifesto. It's like, oh my God, they are ready to move on. So, it was like, it was a no-brainer for us in that regard to think the first thing they really wanted, well, we're going to make it, I forget the name, the Sutu name, what meant together. They didn't want to call it Kosa for different reasons. It's crazy. We're listening. So they invited us to come. They wanted T-shirts. So we got T-shirts with the name, and they invited us to come to a meeting of the youth in the community. And there was a program that was on the table. We're at the head table, and it says, Linda Biehl, mother of us all. And then there, down the line, we were, the next, and then it said, Peter Biehl, father of us all. I think they were adopted. And that's an unusual circumstance. I can't tell you this can happen, but you have to be open to the idea of these possibilities. Because underneath, we are all, I know there are different psychological, all kinds of stuff, but we really need to touch each other as human beings. And when we do, it can be pretty powerful. Now, it can be challenging, but you've got to get up for a good challenge, right?
Absolutely. And it takes a community.
It does.
Yeah.
And just to see the change in their eyes, their physical change, instead of like this, and you go like this, that they are becoming people who are confident that they can make change. So it's kind of a chain of events, so to speak. Yeah.
Linda, to circle back on the extract Brady read from his book around that image that was set in his mind of himself on the front page of a newspaper as a 17-year-old, that stayed with him. It was a piece of history, and it remains exactly like that in his mind. You also saw your daughter on the front pages of newspapers everywhere, but particularly in South Africa. So none of us forget Amy's face. Any of us who were sentient and engaged with our society 29 years ago remember Amy's face. And I really consider it a privilege to sit across from her mother and realize that she and I were both born in 1967, and to say to you that as a 55-year-old woman, I extend my love to you and my thanks to you for being such a wonderful example as a mother, and to show such incredible love for your daughter. What an extraordinary example. Thank you.
And love for our country. And thank you for loving our country and our people, because our journey has been so challenging, and it still is. But I've got goosebumps, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.